Great. Okay, fantastic. Well, look, thank you so much for joining us today. We have Siri Chilazi joining us, who is the co-author of Make Work Fair. Absolutely delighted to have you here. It's a brilliant book. I've really enjoyed reading it. Um, and some of the praise for the book has been extraordinary. Una King, who is the Chief Opportunity Officer at Uber, described it as, making business and HR policies fairer is literally manageable and profitable, especially if you read this book. Indra Nooyi, who's the former chairman and CEO of PepsiCo, chair, I should say, and CEO of PepsiCo, said, you and your co-author are the leading thinkers helping us design workplaces that are not only more fair, but simply better and smarter. So yeah, it's been an absolute joy to read the book, and for me, the reflection is that at the Institute of Business Ethics, we're really thinking about how we put values into action, and fairness alongside other ethical values like accountability, integrity, and transparency are really essential, and one of the core ethical values that we promote here at the IBE. So Siri, delighted to have you here and delighted to hear about the framework that you've developed in the book. And I know I'm going to pass over to you shortly just to kind of start this webinar with a summary of some of the summary of the framework that you came to through the process of writing Make Work Fair. So I'm going to pass over to you now, and I know you've got a short presentation that you'll just talk people through, which is brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you to you and the IBE team for hosting this webinar. And thank you to all of you for being here today, or if you're watching later on the recording. I'm so delighted to join you. As Lauren said, I'm going to offer a couple of sort of high-level framing thoughts in the beginning as fodder for our conversation. Allow me to pull up the slides as I do. And then I'm really excited both for my conversation with you, Lauren, as well as all the questions and thoughts that this might kick up in the audience's mind. So let me start with a little story about a woman named Astrid Linder, who you see here on the left. Some of you may know her, though she's definitely not a household name. Astrid is, in fact, a Swedish engineer, and she is the director of research and traffic safety for Sweden's equivalent of what we have in the US, our National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. In Sweden, it's called the VTI. So Astrid's job, in her own words, is to help keep all occupants in cars as safe as possible, at least in Sweden. But Astrid also knows that this isn't happening and wasn't happening a few years ago, because research done around the world shows that even though women are slightly less likely than men to drive, so they drive a little bit less, which means statistically they end up being involved in fewer accidents, women are actually meaningfully more likely to get injured when they do wind up in car accidents. And Astrid also knows the reason why. One of the primary reasons why women are more likely than men to get injured in car accidents is because around the world, regulations only require car companies to safety test their vehicles on crash test dummies modeled on an average man's body, which means that when car companies are designing the safety features of their cars as they're building them in the first instance, those safety features are designed to keep the average male body safe and nobody else. So in her role, Astrid doesn't have the power to change these regulations around the world. She doesn't have the power to force car manufacturers to do anything, but she did have the power, and in fact, the resources and the ability with her team to design the world's first crash test dummy modeled on the average female body. And that's exactly what she did. So you see Eva Rid here on the right. That's the name of the world's first female crash test dummy. And she is fortunately the first, but not the last, and not the only, because since this first one, both Astrid's team, as well as other research teams and car manufacturers around the world, have started building more and more inclusive dummies, including ones modeled on the smallest female, the largest male, a pregnant woman, and many more. And not only have car companies now taken on the mantle of starting to use these more inclusive dummies in their testing, but regulators around the world, including in the EU and in the United States, are finally starting to catch up as well. And there's proposals around on the table around the world to start requiring manufacturers to test with a range of crash test dummies. I'm sharing this story with you because, in many ways, Astrid Linder exemplifies what making work fair is all about. Making work fair is not a program or a one off initiative or a one off training or the once a year International Women's event or a special Heritage Month celebration, but rather, making work fair is a way of doing things. And specifically, it's a way of doing the things that we're already doing. So Astrid's job was to research and improve car safety anyway. She found a way to make that more fair and include more people in her work. Maybe your job is to invest in companies and founders. How could you do that more fairly? By maybe improving some of your decision making processes or collecting data, comparing who you're investing in and then who you actually end up investing in the end. Is there a huge disparity? Or maybe as part of your day to day job, you run meetings or participate in meetings. Well, science has a lot to say about how we can run these meetings better and more fairly so that we actually benefit from the collective wisdom of everyone present. Or maybe, as many of us do, we often provide either informal feedback to our colleagues, or we might even be in a formal managerial position to conduct performance reviews once or twice a year. Again, data has a lot to tell us about how we can improve those processes and make sure that the feedback and the evaluations that we're giving are more objective and more fair. That's what making work fair is all about. Now, I realize I've used the word fairness many times without actually defining it up until now. So let me share for a moment about what I mean with fairness. Imagine that you're standing here at the starting line of the 100-meter dash at the Olympics. You and your competitors are standing at the same starting line. You're going to cross the same finish line in 100 meters. And in between, you're all going to run this race on the same track. And moreover, you're all wearing sneakers that are identical or very similar to each other. You're also wearing outfits that are pretty much the same. And it's because all those factors are equivalent for you and your competitors that we can accurately say whoever crosses the finish line first is indeed the fastest sprinter today. But now imagine that I came to you before the start of the race and said, could you remove your shoes, please? We're going to have your competitors keep their sneakers on, but you're going to run this race barefoot. Or imagine if I asked you to move from the track over to the grass next to the track. If there are any runners listening in today, you know that running either barefoot or on grass compared to a smooth surface is a lot slower. You're probably going to finish this race last, not because you're a slower runner, but because you're now running the race under different conditions. Or in an analogy that's even more representative of the real world, imagine that I come up to you and move your starting line 20 meters behind everyone else and say, good luck. Let's see how you do. Well, in this scenario, you're definitely going to finish the race after all your competitors. But again, not necessarily because you're a slower runner, but because you have a longer distance to cover. So making work fair is about ensuring that we create a workplace where everyone encounters a genuinely level playing field, where everyone has an equal opportunity to show up at the same starting line and then experience the same conditions at work, the same resources and opportunities to succeed, the same access to high visibility assignments, stretch assignments, the cool projects rather than the office grunt work, equivalent access to supports like mentorship, sponsorship, executive coaching, maybe an access to an executive assistant who can manage your calendar so that you can focus on some of the higher productivity tasks on your plate. it's equalizing all of these kinds of resources and supports in the workplace that is the workplace equivalent of leveling the playing field here on the track and making sure that we're actually giving all of our employees an equal opportunity to show what they can do, what their best work looks like, so that we're then able to accurately spot who, in fact, is the best worker, who is the person that we should be promoting, not just who looks the part or who is very similar to all the people that we've promoted in the past. So, if this is our goal, if making work fair is our goal, how do we actually do this in practice? In our book, my co author Iris Bonet and I propose a 3-part framework for operationalizing this vision. And that is that in order to make work fair, we need to make fairness count, we need to make fairness stick, and we need to make fairness normal. This is really very straightforward. Making fairness count is about managing fairness using exactly the same tools that we're already using to manage our so called core business, whatever that is in your organization. So, how do we manage our core business? Well, we track data on the things, the metrics that we really care about. We might implement goals and put in place incentives to help people make decisions that move those metrics in the right direction. Then we keep tracking the data to see, well, are sales actually going up? Is profitability increasing? Are environmental emissions going down? And if things are indeed tracking on the right track, there's accountability, there's positive consequences. And if not, there's also accountability, and there might be negative consequences for people. But this is how we already manage our core business. All we're suggesting is that we manage fairness using the same tools, but also with the same rigor. Making fairness stick is about making small tweaks to how we're already working, our existing policies, processes, and informal practices to embed fairness into the way work gets done rather than relying on individuals to have good intentions or to remember when they're really busy to do something. This all relies on behavioral science. Iris and I are both behavioral scientists, and so we know very well the research that tells us that systems trump individuals. Even with the best of intentions, we humans are very prone to predictable errors in our decision making. But when we surround ourselves with smart systems, we're able to actually reach our highest and best performance. So that's why it's so important to make fairness stick into the DNA and into the scaffolding of our organizations. And finally, making fairness normal is about embedding it into all the informal everyday interactions, culture, social norms that are not a formal policy or a written down process. And here's where things like I mentioned, social norms or the unspoken but often shared understandings of what kind of behavior is acceptable. The role modeling effect of who we see and who we can aspire to are really important in driving the types of informal behaviors that we want people to exhibit. So I'm going to stop here. There's a lot more to say on all of these topics, and I'm sure we'll dive into it in our conversation and in our Q&A.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Siri. Such a great introduction to kind of some of the themes and the insights coming out of the book via the framework. And as I listened to you talking through the framework, what's really interesting to me is how many parallels there are in how we think about what needs to happen in order to have a genuinely ethical culture where
Mm,
ethics is embedded in the culture. And that's so it's great to hear you talking about it in a slightly different way, focused just on fairness, and I would love to dive into some of the elements that make that a successful program. And when we think about business ethics at the IBE, we think about it in terms of, not just what the ethics team does or the ethics lead,
mhm.
is responsible for. It sits across the whole organization. And I know that comes across in your book too. So I'd love to ask you some questions around kind of some of those elements that we think about in terms of our framework for thinking about business ethics. So my first question is really about leadership. So,
Mm,
we know that many leaders kind of will endorse fairness in principle. Who could disagree with wanting to make something fair, right?
right.
Um, but daily pressures push people back into poor decisions or bad habits. From your perspective, maybe you could just share some visible leadership behaviors that you think make the biggest difference in signaling that fairness is non-negotiable.
Yeah, love the question. And let me just double underline what you said about kind of the approach to ethics,
Mm.
because I feel like this approach of embedding ethics throughout the organization into everything that we're doing, managing it in a data driven way, and ensuring that it's built into formal policies, it's exactly the same thing that we're suggesting companies do with fairness, right? You can't just decree from the top down and put in writing, we are a fair organization. Ethics is a core value, and then expect that to be translated into everyday behaviors and decisions. And I think this is where the rubber really meets the road is companies have aspirations to be X, Y, and Z and do X, Y, and Z, but it's not enough to say it. You have to live it. And so then how do you start living it? So let's talk about leadership behaviors, actually behaviors at any level. As I mentioned, behavioral science shows that we humans often behave in ways that are not consistent with our stated intentions. We want to be fair, we want to be ethical and loyal and honest. But when we're cognitively overloaded, when we're busy, when there's competing pressures, when we're stressed, those are the times when the unconscious part of our brain often takes over decision making, and that deliberative, conscious part of our brain that holds all these high values and intentions takes a back seat. And it's especially in those moments where you can think of a smart system or a smart policy almost as a safety net that helps catch you, right? You're stressed, you're about to make a bad decision, you're falling off the cliff. And now instead of crashing to the ground, there's this safety net that catches you and said, wait, we're going to make sure that we actually think this through. So it could be something simple like how we structure a meeting. We've all been in those meetings where we're making a high stakes decision under time pressure. And all of a sudden, it's just two or three voices of the most senior leaders that get heard. It's very clear that at this high stakes moment, contrarian views are not welcome. Any questions about have we thought through what about this aspect get shut down quickly because we got to move, we got to move. And so that's a classic example of a moment where even though we want to be ethical and fair and thoughtful, a business imperative can take over if we don't have a smart process for running um, what good meetings in place. Something like a simple rule of thumb that says we're going to do a round robin and give everyone a minute to express their view before we make the final decision. Or if we need to take a vote, taking that vote anonymously on post-it notes or some kind of online polling system, instead of going around the room and say, who's in favor? Raise your hand. And of course, if the most senior person in the room is in favor, who's going to have the guts to stand up against them and question that perspective? Or even something simple like having a person whose designated role in the meeting is to ask multiple times, what would be the opposite perspective? It's great we've talked about A, B, and C considerations. What are the considerations that we haven't raised yet to ensure that we have the highest quality decision making? So that's just a simple example for how small everyday systems can help leaders make the best decisions and live up to their most fair and ethical selves.
Fantastic. And I love what you've done there in terms of actually, and it's through the book as well. So throughout Make Work Fair, you're giving these great practical examples
Mm,
of how this works, case studies and insights into, it's so rich in terms of the ideas that it so generously shares
thank you.
to sort of make these things come to life. So And I really agree with what you're saying about those high pressure moments. And that's our ethics at work research shows that very clearly, that when pressure
Mm,
increases, ethical behavior becomes under pressure. And there is a whole range of pressures. And those pressures are systemic, and they are expressed in the culture of the organization, as well as kind of in relation to specific events that might occur that can, create pressure around a whole range of things that can happen in the business environment. When
mm,
you think about leadership in terms of boards or senior execs,
mm.
in terms of assigning ownership of fairness, particularly as you think about in relation to governance, what have you seen in terms of boards or senior executives that are approaching governance well in relation to fairness? Could you talk a little bit about that for me?
It's such a great question. And you had referenced this a moment ago too in talking about, do we task certain people, a small group of people, with making the company ethical or ensuring that we're ethical? And of course, on the one hand, yes. I mean, we do have sustainability officers. We might have a chief diversity officer. On a corporate board, we'll have the finance committee, right? We'll have the succession committee. But at the same time, let's use finance as the example and the parallel for a second. You have a chief financial officer in your organization, but they are rolling up and reporting data that is actually the outcome of the decisions of many other people, not themselves. In other words, every P&L owner up and down the organization is making everyday decisions and acting in ways that shape what the financial data looks like, that then ultimately reaches up to the CFO and that the CFO reports out. So in reality, everyone in the, or most people in the organization, have to be smart about financial management, have to be good stewards of the organization's finances in order for the finances to be doing well. Um, Communications is the same, right? You often have a PR department where they write the company's annual report and the CEO's most high profile speeches. So they're the communications experts. But every single person in your whole organization is talking in meetings, writing emails, creating slides, basically on a daily basis. So they need to have a base level of communication skills in order for the organization as a whole to succeed. And I would argue that ethics and fairness are exactly the same. You might have a few people at the top or a subcommittee of the board that is sort of tasked with having special expertise in that area, past experience, knowledge otherwise. But unless those values and those ways of behaving are embedded throughout the whole organization, all the way down to the most junior intern, you're not going to get the best results.
Brilliant. Yes, and that is such an important part of, what we're seeing. We've always heard that phrase of kind of tone for the top matters, and I've always
Yes.
slightly kind of struggled with that phrase in some ways. I think it is really important, but I do also love that kind of concept of tone from within, and that sense that actually,
Yeah.
there needs to be a tone throughout the whole organization, and leadership, yes, is important, but we are looking at a system, when we
Yeah.
think about an organization, and the levers for change are across that whole organization. So
Yeah.
yeah, no, that's great.
And I'll just, if I can say
Yeah,
one more thing on that
please.
quickly, Lauren, the reason it's so powerful because research shows the biggest shapers of our behaviors as humans are actually the people and the norms surrounding us directly. So imagine that you're mid level in a company and you hear your CEO saying something and the board saying something, but your immediate manager says something else. The person who you have to deal with day in and day out, because you've never even met the CEO or the board, the person who is in charge of your performance evaluation, who's in charge of your bonus, following that person and their vision and their values is what you're much more likely to do than going against your immediate manager to align yourself with the CEO. So that's why it's so important to kind of, yes, the tone needs to come from the top. I absolutely agree. But unless it truly cascades down the organization, it's not going to impact the behaviors of the front line and the midline. And I hear this frustration from senior executives all the time. They say, this is what we're saying, this is what we're doing. And as I look down my reporting line, they are not falling in line.
Very interesting. And I was in a discussion last week, convening that we were holding. I'm going slightly off topic now, but it is relevant, on new legislation in the UK, which is
Mm,
looking at failure to prevent fraud. And actually, in terms of actually embedding a really good risk management approach to that, it was about thinking about, okay, so say if you're someone in the communications team, how do you know that that statement that you're pushing out on a press release or, through social media or wherever is actually accurate and verified? How do you know that? And going to that point where you can actually prove that it is, as opposed to assume that it is,
yeah,
that would be necessary around, demonstrating failure to prevent. And in a way, it's a very interesting mindset shift that in terms of in relation to
yes,
fairness. How do you know that you aren't being that how are you preventing this from occurring in the workplace? Anyway, that's an aside.
exactly.
But
No, but it's a great example. Yeah,
yeah, so when you think about strategy and how you kind of, if you want to think about how to embed into the culture fairness as a
mm,
strategic priority, so perhaps you've had an issue, you're recovering from a crisis in relation to unfairness in the workplace, whatever that might look like. What if you were working with a company, what's sort of where would you go first if you were thinking
yeah,
about process redesign or thinking about, why they might want to start where they start? How do you
yeah,
tend to think about that when you're working
yeah.
with organizations?
Let me actually give you a real world example of an
Okay.
organization that my colleagues and I did work with and we did do research with. This wasn't a crisis situation, but I think exactly the same frame would apply. This is a global telecommunications and engineering firm that employs more than 100,000 people in more than 100 countries around the world. Their workforce overall is about 75% men, and about the managers are about 80% men. So this organization is looking at their global workforce and saying, we realize that we're really under indexed on women because every single society in which we operate is roughly 50-50 women and men. But another pattern that they had noticed in looking at their data, so they were starting with step one, making fairness count, is they had noticed that they weren't really benefiting from the global nature of their workforce because all of their Chinese employees tended to be working in China and all the French employees in France and the Mexicans in Mexico. And they said, we are missing an opportunity here to have people crossing geographies so that we can actually benefit from these global perspectives. So it was this analysis of data that allowed them to elucidate their goal, which was we're trying to hire more women into all levels of the organizations, and also what they called non-nationals, meaning people whose nationality was different than the country that they were going to be working in. And their first instinct to address this challenge was to do something very typical, like an unconscious bias training program or a diversity training program for all of their managers. That would have been a very time intensive undertaking, a massively costly undertaking. You have to translate these materials into 100 different languages, kind of a nightmare. And by the way, there's a lot of research on the effectiveness of various different kinds of diversity trainings and unconscious bias trainings. And the message from that massive body of research, which is very clear, and that is that those trainings don't actually shift behaviors, measurable behavior. They don't shift what people do. People might love the training. They might say they learned a lot in the session, but then they continue to behave exactly as they were before. So we worked in collaboration with this company instead to build an embedded solution to make fairness stick. So we created with them a 7-minute video that was going to be shown to managers who were about to hire a new team member at the point where they had raised a requisition for an open role, but they hadn't yet received the submitted applications. And so we ran an experiment with more than 3,000 managers around the world, hiring for more than 10,000 open positions a few years ago, where some managers continued business as usual, and others were invited to watch this 7-minute video before they could gain access to the submitted applications. And the video was super simple. It featured senior leaders of the company, including a board member, including an HR executive, emphasizing that this decision managers were about to make was really consequential for the company because every person you bring in really shapes our performance and shapes our culture. It then gave managers concrete tools for how to make the hiring decision better. Specifically, they asked managers to think about what are the skills that are already present on your existing team and what are skills and capabilities that might be missing. And how could this new person that you're about to bring in round out the collective competence of the team? And then finally, the video did a third thing that was really important, which is it explicitly affirmed the company's culture and values. It said, we need diverse perspectives in our decision making because we're serving a globally diverse customer base and because we know that diverse teams make better decisions. We also feel like it's our responsibility to reflect the diversity of the societies in which we operate around the world. They said those things explicitly to signal and reinforce that these are values that the company holds. But as you can see, and I think this is actually really important, they tied those values to concrete behaviors. So that it's just not this vacuous statement at the top of we believe in X, but look, we believe in X, and here's how that needs to now factor in to this concrete hiring decision that you're about to make. And long story short, the video was extremely effective at increasing the shortlisting of women, the shortlisting and hiring of non-national candidates, and especially at increasing how many female non-national candidates who were the least likely in the beginning to get hired into this organization to be hired. So I just think this is a great example that kind of pulls together how do you make fairness count? You start with the data to diagnose what problem you're trying to solve so that you can then develop a targeted solution or intervention. You embed that intervention into your existing processes. So just a small tweak to the way they were already hiring. And then you use this whole process to make fairness normal by reinforcing the values that your organization wants to live by, and by connecting those values to everyday behaviors.
Brilliant. Yeah,
So
such a
this is what
great
I would advise all other
example.
companies to do, whether they're in a crisis or not.
Yeah, brilliant. We've had a question come into the Q&A box, which I'll run through. I think you've touched on it, but I think it would be great to just give some thought to it. But
Yeah, yeah.
what can leaders do to promote a culture of fairness and inclusion, e.g., a senior management team who have all been in the same school, and resist some of the actions to promote an inclusive culture? So that's a kind of,
Mm,
us and them situation, isn't it? Which is, the question doesn't give an insight into what they mean by the same school exactly, but but
yeah.
perhaps you could give some thoughts as to things people can do in the face of that, in order to promote an inclusive culture.
Yeah. A couple of ideas here. One of my personal favorite tools in almost any situation is questioning and asking, oh, this is
Mm.
interesting. We have a group that's making important strategic decisions, like the leadership team, and everyone's gone to, if you meant an actual school, like Oxford or Cambridge, by the school, like, right? Everyone went there. Um, that's going to mean that there's a powerful way in which these people's perspectives have been shaped through their education in the same way. It doesn't mean that they think similarly about everything, that they always agree, but there's a huge shared perspective there, which also then means that other perspectives are likely missing. So asking the question, what perspectives might we be missing? How might this lead us to have blind spots? And the world is full of business examples of this, by the way. Apple releasing phones that don't fit into some people's hands, consumer wristbands that only fit men's wrists, shoe shapes that only fit men's feet, just by way of a few examples. I can recommend Caroline Criado Perez's book, Invisible Women, which is 300 pages full of examples of how the world is designed to fit some people, but not others. So there's real business consequences to that, because you won't be making products or services that are appealing to as many consumers as they would be if you had factored more diverse perspectives into their development. So I think questioning is one way. Another example is using whatever leverage you do have to force the issue and to put it onto the table. I had a recent conversation with an executive from one of the world's leading executive search firms. And what often happens with them is they get a very restrictive brief from the client who's looking to bring an executive on, saying, we need a candidate who is X, Y, and Z. A faith-based organization, for example, might say, we need to hire an executive who has these skills, but they also need to belong to our faith. And so, what this search firm has done is it has implemented and tested an internal policy where, in addition to presenting a few candidates that fit the brief, they'll always add a so called wild card candidate who has all the competencies that the client is looking for, but doesn't maybe fit. The client might say they need to be of the same faith. They might not be. The client might say they need to have C suite experience. Well, this person will have all the requisite skills, but perhaps not that C suite experience. So they are trying to broaden their clients' eyes to saying, look, you're being very narrow here. You're just looking at this narrow pool. The world is actually full of people who could bring exactly the expertise you need. And because we have the leverage and the power of presenting to you a slate, we're going to nudge you in that direction. We can't force you to hire that person, but at least we can start to open your eyes by kind of giving you something that you wouldn't have otherwise considered. So that's the second strategy. The first is questions. The second is using your leverage to kind of put forth some new options. And then the third strategy I'll offer is working with the proverbial choir. Our human brains naturally tend to the negative, and we're naturally very attuned to who is against us, who opposes us, who's a roadblock. This is just a tendency of human brains, by the way, as proven by the research. So there's something lovely called the 20-60-20 rule, which many of you might know, which says that basically whatever you're trying to do, push through a new initiative, launch a new product, get people to buy a new iPhone. There's 20% of people who are enthusiastically with you. They are your choir, your evangelists, your early adopters. Then there's another 20% at the opposite end of the spectrum that will never understand your vision, will never buy in, and they're going to try to put roadblocks in your way at every turn. And then in between these two extremes, you've got the 60% persuadable middle. We humans tend to over focus on the negative 20% and say, look at all these people who don't get it. Look at all these members of the senior leadership team who don't buy in. How are we going to convince them? How are we going to change their minds? Well, unfortunately, research also shows that changing people's deeply held beliefs and fundamental attitudes is really hard. It's not impossible, but it's really, really hard. So we could get a lot further, a lot faster, if we instead channeled our focus and our energy toward the 20% of the people who already get it and the 60% who can be persuaded. So might there be one person on the leadership team that sees the same problem that you see, that agrees that it's a problem that should be solved? Work with that person. Focus on giving that person the tools, the support, the ammunition that they need to start influencing, for example, their colleagues on that senior leadership team, instead of focusing on the fact that the majority of them aren't with you for now.
Great. Yeah, and there's so much that is similar to how we think about values in at the IBE. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about it in that way, because I think those unspoken about norms that can develop within cultures, leadership of leadership teams or boards.
Yeah,
This is how we do things here. Challenging that and giving voice to your concerns about that can be very difficult. And so having some tools and feeling that you're able to take people with you, you're able to kind of ask questions in the right way, that you can find people who can become supporters who can help to influence that group or that
exactly.
culture is very important. It's such an important skill for developing a values-based leadership and
Yeah,
culture, but it's also not something to be underestimated in terms of how challenging it can be for cultures to change, for people to change. So it does. There's a huge amount of work in there, and I think the book offers some really interesting, again, insights into how that has worked in practice. And I think learning from case studies and is so important in all of this. I've
yeah.
got another question for you that's come in from one of our the people on the call. So
Wonderful.
people tend to hire and promote, not necessarily rationally, but emotionally, e.g., someone
Yes.
reminds them of themselves. Can
Yeah.
competency-based CVs and career ladders change that? So,
Yeah.
yeah, and if not that
It's
specifically, what would you recommend about that kind of hire? I'm now adding to the question, but hiring in
yeah.
one's own image.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And this is actually one of the topics and issues where we have the most robust research base. So we truly know what works and what doesn't to increase fairness and objectivity in hiring and promotions decision making. So let me give you a high level answer and then some very concrete strategies. The high level answer is that structure and formality tends to be the enemy of bias, whereas informality and lack of structure is really a breeding ground for bias. So the more we can make our hiring, promotion, evaluation procedures very structured, very formalized, so that it's not just this informal thing, but there's an actual, SOP of here's how we do it, step one, step two, step three, the more likely we are to be able to evaluate objectively. So this is things like developing an assessment rubric before you look at a single candidate. Sitting back and saying, what is it that we need a person to be able to do in this role? And I'm not talking about check the box qualifications like degree from this kind of school or 5 years of experience in project management, because we all know there's plenty of people in the world who have done project management for 5 years, and some of them are good at it and some of them are not. So that's not a clear enough criterion. We need to drill down to the skills and actual behaviors that we need someone to be able to exhibit. One other great example of this is something like executive presence or communication skills. If you ask 10 people, what does it mean for someone to have executive presence? What does it mean for someone to be a great communicator? You're going to get 10 different answers. So that's not a granular enough guide for what we are looking for. We have to break it down to the level of, okay, good communication skill means listening attentively, being able to summarize what they've heard, right? Something like this. So once you have your list of what you're looking for, the next step would be to use, ideally, work sample tests to assess whether candidates have those skills. A work sample test is very simply a task or an exercise that is designed to mimic the actual job as closely as possible. So instead of looking at that piece of paper that is someone's CV, if you're hiring someone for a role that involves a lot of writing, have them write something and then evaluate the quality of the actual writing instead of asking them, well, tell me about a time in the past when you wrote, an important briefing memo. Or if we are in hiring somebody for a senior level role, where a big part will be public speaking and being a persuasive presence on a stage, have them give a presentation and evaluate the actual quality of how they present. Research shows that people's performance on these types of work sample tests has the highest correlation to their actual performance on the job compared to interviews, compared to resume reviews, compared to cognitive tests, compared to any of these tools that are unfortunately much more prevalent out there in the world for assessing people's competence. So those are two quick practical examples of how to put this idea of more structure and formality into use. I'd add that we want to create the evaluation rubric in advance too of, okay, if this is the work sample test that we're going to use, what does good performance actually look like? And if we're grading on a scale of 1 to 5, what's a 1 performance? What's a 3? What's a 5? So that when we have people assess, that we know that they're assessing the same things and the things that we want them to be evaluating.
I love that. And I love the way in which you're highlighting exactly how taking this more structured, formalized approach and being focused on their actual performance in work, in a work setting, a work sample, is giving you better outcomes. So you're getting to better hiring practices, not just fairer, but actually, that
Exactly.
is tied to better performance. That's brilliant. If we shift now to thinking about kind of evaluation. So your framework with talks about make it count, and data is absolutely essential to
Yeah.
your three framework approach. So for a company or an organization starting from scratch, if you were thinking about the kind of minimal viable evaluation of fairness interventions, if you had a sense of,
Mm.
is this still rigorous enough to matter? Where do you go with that? So if you're starting out, and you're thinking about, is this a fair organization? What's the minimum that you want to see? Do you get asked that a lot? Are you kind of,
Oh, it's the first time ever I'm getting that question, which is fascinating.
yeah, do you have a kind of like minimum piece, or do you feel like there's just people are coming to you wanting to, because one of the things that I'm interested in is, when we think about business ethics, we're thinking about risk as well as opportunity. So
Yeah.
avoiding risk and not thinking about where you end up in a place of bribery or corruption, or,
Mm, mm.
and maybe fairness doesn't get considered in that way. I'm kind of interested in that concept of where fairness sits in that spectrum of kind of thinking about it in terms of, I think it sits more in the opportunity space, but I'm very interested in what how
I
you
think
would
so too.
see that and frame that.
Yeah, I see companies coming at this from both angles, which is the angle of we understand that having the best people in the right roles at the right time doing their best work will enable us as an organization to turbocharge our performance. So
Yeah,
we
right.
see the opportunity. How do we move closer to it? I also see companies coming at it from, we're worried about a lawsuit. We already had a lawsuit. We had to pay a huge settlement. Our reputation took a huge hit. How do we improve just for the sake of avoiding the risk and minimizing the risk going forward? And I think both of the sides of the equation are very real, by the way. I wish that all companies saw the opportunity, but if it's the risk that motivates them to start doing better things and running their organization in a better, fairer way, me personally, I'm a pragmatist. I'll take it. Um, but in terms of getting to the part of your question about sort of where does this sit or what's the minimum level, I don't think there's a single answer because it's so contextual. It's kind of like asking a company like Amazon, when have you made enough profit? When is your market share high enough? The answer is never. Right? We always want to sell more. We want to make more profit. We want to capture a bigger share of the market. We want to hire better people. We want to dominate more. Um, and conditions are changing and all of that. So you're always adapting. But again, that's the business, that's the mindset that we have in our core business that we never question. Everyone takes it for granted that we're always striving for more. But then when it comes to fairness, we ask, well, when is it enough? When can we declare victory and say, that's fine, the women problem is solved, the ethnicity problem is solved, we can rest? And I am the bearer of the news that says, well, just like you're never done dominating the market, you're never done bettering your organization and making it a better and fairer and more ethical place to work, right? So it doesn't really matter where you start because you always have room to improve. And even if you're the world's leading company on this, just like Apple or Amazon is in their own vertical, you still got room to improve. I
Fantastic.
hope
I
that's
love
not a
that.
cop out answer. I hope that
No, I don't
answers your
think it is.
question.
I think it's great, and I think it's not a cop-out answer at all. I think there are obviously, checks and balances, legal requirements, thinking
Yes.
about that kind of bare minimum, but actually hearing you say that people are very engaged in this conversation, wanting to do more, whether that's from a place of kind of crisis recovery or a place of really enlightened enhancement to performance. I think that's very good to hear. And I think,
Yeah.
again, coming back to the core principles of the book, what you're really advocating is that this is something that is doable. It's something that people can do, and that there are tools and approaches out there that are data driven, grounded in behavioral science, and that work, right? So
Right.
so
Right.
how you get better at that. And I think that's where the IBE is as well. We're trying to in some ways demystify some of this to kind of say it's not hard to create an ethical culture, but you
Yeah.
do need certain things in place, and those are actually non-negotiable, and they do have an impact on people's behaviors, on their decision making, on how they show up day to day in terms of their own leadership and their own approach to doing the right thing in work. So I think that's, you know,
100%.
and that the level with which you are paying attention to thinking about how to do this is similar in some ways to some of our supporters when we talk, and they really do, really are experts in this space, but also wanting to explore exactly how to approach this in a way that is about continual improvement. So, yeah, no, it's very
Exactly.
interesting, the parallels.
And this is where it goes back to the data, right? Because
Mm.
Iris and I like to say the data tells the tale, or the data doesn't lie. That will always tell you, are you making progress or not?
Yeah.
Are all these things that you're doing, are they actually resulting in a more ethical culture, fewer violations, fewer complaints? Are they actually resulting in a more fair organization where the best people advance on their merit, on their skills and their demonstrated capabilities, rather than some other considerations like relationships or internal politics? These are things that we actually can measure and assess very rigorously.
Yeah, brilliant. And I know we've got some investors on the call, and I recently went and talked to a group of investors about ethical culture, values-based decision making. And one of the questions that I got asked, which I thought was a great question, was from one of the investors there who said they were going to go and meet a chair
Mm.
after this meeting, and they said, what would be the questions you would ask a chair about whether or not they were leading a values-centered or values focused organization? And I thought it was a great question. And I was kind of,
Great
I
question.
felt it was a hard question to answer because my sort of questions were, well, that it's so contextual and it's so based on
Yeah,
where they are in their ethics journey that it's hard to kind of generalize. Um,
yeah.
but I'm interested in kind of posing the same difficult question to you. I'll just put you on the spot, Siri, here.
Uh,
But
it's
but
it's
but
awesome.
if you're kind of starting a conversation with a chair about their organization, um, where do you tend to start? How do you begin that conversation? I'm just really interested to hear your thoughts on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. The first thing I have to say is major kudos to this investor for taking this proactive stance of saying, wait, I'm about to give you money. I can interrogate, like, I have power here, right? I can
Yeah.
interrogate you and I can try to shift your behavior through my power position in this exchange. I wish more people did that. Just like the executive search firm example that I gave a moment ago, we all have leverage somewhere, right? We all have some little process or way of working that we can control, that we can start to make more fair. So massive kudos to this investor for doing that. Let that be an inspiration for us all. Now, as far as your actual question, I think for me, it's less about what specific thing you ask, but it's what emerges in the answer. So let's say we asked a CEO, how do you think about fairness in your organization? How do you make sure that people are having an equal opportunity here to succeed, and that you're actually spotting the talent, giving it the right support for it to advance, that some people don't unnecessarily have hurdles placed in their way? Let's say this is kind of a broad opening for a conversation. And then the CEO says, oh, we're incredibly focused on this. I can't tell you how much I think about it. I'm a sponsor for the Women's Network. And we also have a Rainbow Coalition, which does some great events. And we have that training program for veterans. And we sponsor the local LGBTQ parade every year. Right. So sounds like a lot. Sounds like a lot of great activity. Sounds like a lot of commitment. But none of this has anything to do with the business. None of this has anything to do with how work gets done on a daily basis, because it's really easy to write a check. It's really easy to show up to one quarterly meeting or to put your logo and as a sponsor for an event without having to actually change what you do and how you behave and how your team behaves and change the results on the ground. Now, imagine this conversation unfolding with a different CEO who will say, yes, we care about this deeply, but also talks about, well, we've built that into our incentive compensation for the executives. And once a quarter, I review all the numbers, not just on representation, but on things like pay gaps, promotions, the talent pipeline. Who have we identified as a high potential that could be a successor at the leadership levels in the next 1, 3, maybe 5 years? We actually review that to look at not just things like gender and race, but even geographic representation, socioeconomic backgrounds. When you start to get answers like this, you start to hear that this is something that the company is serious about actually doing as part of their everyday work, not just being quick and lazy and writing a check and saying, check the box. this is done. So that's the kind of answer that I would be looking for, is seeing how, and exactly the same thing would apply to ethics, by the way. Not just
Mm.
saying, oh, yes, well, we've signed this pledge and we're part of this ethics coalition and we love the IBE's work. I mean, that's all great. But what are you doing on the ground? How is this translating into behaviors up and down the hierarchy of the organization? That I would be excited. I would be excited to get that kind of response from a CEO.
Amazing, amazing. So we're out of time. I could carry on talking and hearing your insights. I
Me
think that's
too.
brilliant. I love the answer to that last question. Just superb. And for me, I loved the book. I'm interested, where do you want to see this go next for you? Like, what,
Mm.
you write a book, you push it out into the world, and what are you seeing at the moment? What do you hope for, say, if we were sitting here in 12 months' time, what
Yeah.
would you love to see as a result of this work?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking. Iris, my co author, and I wrote this book because we're both passionate not just about being researchers and generating knowledge, but also equally importantly, making sure that the knowledge and insights we're generating through rigorous research reach the hands of people like you all on the call, who can actually use those insights to change organizations, to change the world, to make organizations better. So, my ardent hope would be that in 12 months' time, a lot of these evidence based practices, which have already been proven to work, are adopted much more widely. That's part one. And part two, that more organizations are testing and evaluating the things that they are already doing, or maybe if they're considering some kind of process change, they're going to evaluate the impact of that process change so that we can generate even more knowledge about what works and what doesn't. Because this is the thing about humans, is they'll always surprise you. Humans don't follow theories. They don't follow laws like the physical world does, the law of gravity. And so with humans, the only way to understand what really is going on is to study them empirically. And as much knowledge as we already have and as we packed into the book, I want to generate a lot more. And we need your help. We need to be partnering with real organizations in order to do those studies and to generate more of that knowledge.
Amazing. Siri, thank you so, so much. What a fantastic answer to
Thank you,
that
Lauren.
question about your hopes for the book. And, I wish you all the best with it. Thank you so much for coming on to the webinar today. And I look
Really a
forward to
pleasure.
continuing the conversation. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Thank you, Lauren. It was really a pleasure. And
Thank
thank you
you.
all for tuning in.